Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Patricia Griffin, and I'm a partner at MBG, which is a Washington, D.C. federal government relations firm. I've had the honor of working with the James Beard Foundation for a couple years now, both on their federal policy work and supporting them with their boot camps, which has just been an honor and a thrill. Before we start into the conversation, I wanted to point out a couple of technical pieces and reminders. First, the webinar, like all JBF industry support webinars, will be recorded and made available online in about 24 hours. You should be able to find it at the link on the screen by tomorrow. And you also can use that link to register for all the upcoming webinars. We are going to save the questions for the end of this conversation, but please feel free to submit them along the way and while we're having our conversation. You'll see that there's a question icon should be on the right side of your screen, and it has a little message bubble. So you can populate that, and we will visit that at the end of the conversation. If you have any technical difficulties, we will do our best to help you with that as well. Please go to the question button and type in your problem. If it doesn't work, often the best solution is to log on and log off and log back on. So I hope that works. All right, let's get going. So today's webinar is entitled Where We Are, Policy COVID-19. In addition to being a JBF industry education session, this is also a part of the first ever virtual JBF Chefs Bootcamp for Policy and Change. Since 2012, chef boot camps for policy and change have inspired and trained chefs around the country to mobilize around a variety of policies related to the food system and the restaurant industry. The goal is to train leaders in the culinary world to use their voice to support policy change at the national, state, and local level. The industry session is part of the James Beard Foundation's work to ensure that the industry has timely, relevant, and actionable information during this time where there's a need for constant response due to COVID-19 and the organizing being done to dismantle systemic racism in our society, which also includes our food system. This isn't an easy time for anybody. I and the James Beard Foundation absolutely don't have all the answers, but we can create safe spaces for tough conversations and identify ways that our community can lift up and support the work of others. And we appreciate feedback on that opportunity. Talking about policy change is difficult under the best of circumstances. And now it may seem a little silly or tone deaf when we're really trying to focus on dismantling racism, securing justice for Black victims of police violence, and preventing the deaths of millions from COVID-19. But while we're working together on those primary issues, we must also work together to make sure that children and families have access to food, restaurants stay open, and workers are protected. All these policy fights are happening right now in Congress. We need your voices to make sure that these important issues and others don't get lost. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and I'm thrilled to get started. We have 4 fantastic guests, and I will quickly introduce them, and then we'll get right into it. First, we have Katherine Miller, which many of you might know, Vice President of Impact Programs at the James Beard Foundation. Next, we have Eyang Garrison, Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director to the longtime, amazing, fearless leader, Congressman Fudge from Ohio. We then have Monica Gonzales, Associate Director of Federal Government Relations for Share Our Strength, wonderful organization that focuses on eradicating childhood hunger. Again, an organization I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And last but not least, we have Eric Deebles, Policy Director for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, a lead organization advocating for sustainable agriculture and small farmers here in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, Katherine, I'm going to start with you. For many years, and I've been involved in some of this, JBF has encouraged chefs to get involved in supporting issues around the food system with a focus on hunger and food access and sustainable practices. Now restaurants, as a part of many industries that are at the eye of the COVID storm, are needing to engage the federal government for their own support. How has this affected JBF's role in federal advocacy?
Great, and thank you so much, Tricia, for coordinating this panel, for inviting all the amazing guests. It's so nice to have you all with us today as part of this industry seminar. You know, for the James Beard Foundation, I think for many years we've been focused on positive progressive policy change, almost in a vacuum of like all the things we wanted to do better. So we were able to focus on how we end food waste, or how we protect American fisheries, or how we make sure that kids get access to nutritious school lunches, or how we ensure that SNAP or continues, or how we, you know, make sure that young women farmers have access or to financing. So all of these things seemed great. And then two things happened over the last 138 days, and I'm sort of counting them in days, right? That I feel like we've been in a little bit of lockdown. Is first, there was a wholesale shutdown of the restaurant industry. And with that wholesale shutdown of the restaurant industry that started on or around the first week in March, we also saw the impacts that had on the localized food system. Suddenly, millions of workers were out of work. They were cut off from their day jobs, so to speak. Farmers were put at risk. Fishermen were put at risk. Linen operators were put at risk, right? This idea of the circular food system, the circular economy that the community-based restaurants, especially independent restaurants, were at the center of, was gone. And it has been shut down and reopened inconsistently. And so that led to another fight related to how we get financial relief for the industry and the related businesses that are part of our community, our food community. Then we were also touched, you know, by the increased awareness around systemic racism and police violence and brutality, and the murders of Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of many others. And that led to another aspect of policy advocacy that people wanted to focus on within the food system, because the majority of food producers, the majority of people that work in food and restaurants are actually people of color, predominantly women of color. And so this became another aspect, another lens to the work that we had to do. And then the third piece we had to look at was almost 1/3 to 1/2 of all independent restaurants made a change in the early days of COVID and continue to do it to provide emergency meals for restaurant workers, for food communities, for the people that were not able to access food in the traditional ways that they had. So schools in some cases, many of those were done through World Central Kitchen or organizations like Off Their Plate who need additional financing. So suddenly we were in a place where it wasn't just let's end food waste and, you know, meet our climate goals, or let's figure out how we protect and preserve SNAP. It was, we need more money for SNAP. We need more money for emergency response. We need more money for farmers. We need more money for restaurants. And then we also need policies that are written in ways to make them anti-racist, right? Where they're really centered in the communities that they serve and the workers that they serve. So it completely changed everything that we're doing. We helped set up the Independent Restaurant Coalition to advocate on behalf of federal funding. It increased our partnership work with organizations like Share Our Strength. It increased our work with community-based organizations around the country focused on whether it was feeding or emergency responses. So for us, it's been an amazing journey, but it's been a new learning. But I really think at the center of that has been these community-based restaurants that are part of our overall food system and that touch every aspect of that work, and really making sure that they are trained and mobilized so that they can take action in a productive way to get things done.
Thank you, Katherine. You touched on a whole host of array of issues that we're going to touch on with our other speakers. I appreciate that. Eyang, I'm going to go to you. We know that hunger and access to healthy foods is a major issue in the United States before COVID, it's a struggle to even believe that we have the challenges and the hurdles before us in that space in the United States. But the pandemic has really shown a light on additional inequities in the hunger community and the food insecure community. Would you mind talking a little bit from a health and economic standpoint about how this pandemic is affecting our food insecure communities?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you said it well, that, the issues of food insecurity and hunger existed, long before this pandemic, but, it's has definitely exacerbated food insecurity and pervasive poverty really across the country. Food banks have really become the lifeline for so many, particularly those who perhaps have found themselves suddenly without a job or an income to feed themselves or their families. In my boss's district, the Greater Cleveland Food Bank has been amazing. They have fed thousands of people on any given day through drive-through feeding sites. And, her district is no different than any others. I think we've all seen the images of long lines of cars, waiting to be served at local food banks really across the country. We saw SNAP applications skyrocket in my boss's district and again across the country, particularly in the month of April. And we know that SNAP caseloads are going to continue to remain high. I think people were scared, particularly in the early weeks of the pandemic. They were scared to take public transportation in order to go to their local grocery store. Parents and families were understandably hesitant and perhaps scared as well to visit their local school or feeding site to pick up meals made available to kids who were impacted by school closures. Meeting certain work requirements and work study requirements for college students to receive SNAP all of a sudden became impossible, as unemployment rates continue to climb, and donations to area food banks in some places all but dried up because of the loss of revenue for farmers and producers who use that source of income to cover the administrative costs associated with donating food, not only to food banks, but restaurants and hotels and other places within the food supply chain. So my boss, Congresswoman Fudge, knew we had to act quickly in Congress to provide relief to all those people that are hurting, both in her district and really across the country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Monica, so Share Our Strength's mission is to end childhood hunger, and we know that work is ongoing, and we don't see the end in sight, unfortunately. And a lot of that work that you do is in partnership with chefs around the country, like the James Beard Foundation, to advocate for good policies and more resources. I have to say, it was mentioned by Katherine, I have just been overwhelmed by the role that restaurants have taken in supporting their most vulnerable communities at this time. Considering they're trying to keep their doors open, pay their folks, feed their folks. And so I would love for you, if you could, to talk a little bit about the role of the restaurant in feeding people during the pandemic and some of the ways that they're doing that.
So thank you so much. First, I just want to thank you for having me on this panel, this webinar here today. And I also in particular just want to give a particular nod to Congresswoman Fudge, who has really been a tremendous leader in making sure that kids and families have access to food. In particular, her leadership on pandemic EBT, I think what that has accomplished in reaching so many kids has been truly remarkable and impactful. So just want to say thanks to Eyang's work as her staff person and their leadership on that front. I just want to say that, the most difficult time that we are in right now, it's so much uncertainty. I'm in awe of the restaurants and the chefs who continue to step up to want to be partners and to feed their community. I think what we all have to recognize is that, we we know how to respond to a natural disaster. We did not understand what this was going to be going forward. That there was no going to be end time that would be certain, or that we could kind of guess, and that there was going to be some particular geographic area. Usually with a natural disaster, you have all these things, and you can actually do congregate feeding. Under this particular circumstances, the rule book kind of went out the window. So, for sure strength, audiences, that have been so deeply affected by coronavirus, kids and families at risk, but the culinary professionals who have helped us to fundraise, heighten awareness, and compel legislators to support programs to combat hunger, child hunger. But, recently we have really seen so many great innovations from the restaurant community in partnering with community organizations to help feed children, especially when sites have had to close down and they've been able to really step up to the plate. So we have funded a small number of chef-driven pilot programs that have helped feed their communities. These pilots have included targeted grants to communities in Sacramento, Washington, D.C., Charlotte, and throughout the state of Florida. And these programs have distributed thousands of meals to help reach kids and families at risk of hunger. So you really see these partnerships, restaurants working with nonprofits to keep their kitchens open and retain staff while cooking food for those who need it most. And these partnerships are seeing great success and in cities nationally. And federal funding could really help extend these partnerships and initiatives and make them more sustainable. We want to make sure that we capture and hold on to these innovations and these solutions that have been incredibly helpful. I think Eyang, really kind of touched on some of the challenges, which is we have food banks that are really strapped. We have school nutrition workers who are really frontline first responders. And then we have all the charitable organizations working together. So, this is really a true safety net, trying to make sure that kids and families don't fall through the cracks, but they continue to access food. And so just a big shout out to all the chefs and restaurant partners who've really stepped up when they have so much going on.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Eric, now to you. So the production, and the supply of chain around food affects all the different things that we've been talking about so far on this panel. And we can see the interconnectedness on this. We know there's been some huge challenges on that front, and in particular for the small farmers and the sustainable farmers. What have been, the biggest challenges during this crisis for the small farmer to date?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to stand in a little box next to some really august speakers and to speak a little bit about the issues that you're talking about, the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on small and mid-sized farmers in particular. First, farmers are people too, so they are stressed in the same way that we're all stressed by this sort of ongoing pandemic. They have parents, they have kids, they live in communities just like the rest of us, and so they're challenged in those ways as well. They also share a couple of challenges, I think, directly in line with the folks on the call today, the restaurant operators and owners and chefs and food system workers, in that the local and regional direct marketing farmers in particular rely on those direct market relationships in order to earn a premium for their product that lets them operate. And the things that we did to help stem the spread of the pandemic are the very things that sort of rob them of those markets. Closing restaurants, that was incredibly painful for the folks on this call, but it also hurt every single farmer that was selling to that restaurant. Closing farmers markets, closing schools, closing stadiums, that's what took those markets away from farmers. And then in perhaps one of the most dramatic fashions, the complete collapse of the slaughter industry and the incredibly challenging environment where workers were asked to go back into production facilities even though they knew that they were going to be sick, even though that they knew that they were going to be exposed to other people who were sick without proper PPE and without accommodations made by the large plant operators. We saw a real breakdown in across the entirety of the food system. And the actions taken by the administration to address them were really lacking, and at times just outright cruel. The way in which USDA designed support programs for farmers in the wake of the coronavirus, they created something called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, which had two separate components: a food box program where farmers sold to aggregators. The U.S. government bought those boxes and then passed those along to emergency food operations and organizations. And then the direct aid component was also the other half of that CFAP program that USDA put together. And that program worked great for big organizations with simple planting systems and very complicated organization structures. It did not work well for small and diversified farmers that were selling into those local and regional markets and supplying a lot of the restaurateurs here. And that's been a real challenge, because now we've got some mid-sized farmers who are getting close to October and November, which is when everybody's operating loans come due, and they still don't have a market. And they've been planting this year in an environment in which maybe restaurants will be open, now maybe they're going to be closed again. So they've put crops in the ground and they're going to pull them out in the fall, and they don't know if they're going to get paid on them. And if they don't, I'm really concerned that we're looking at a large-scale collapse for mid-sized and small farms across the country.
Oh, thank you, Eric. So we've set a little bit of a stage here, a challenging one to say the least. I want to now pivot and talk a little bit more directly about policy, the policies that have been developed or designed and talked about. And Katherine, I'm gonna start with you. You talked a bit about the relief that restaurants need right now, and some of them may seem obvious. What legislation has been created and is being worked on to support and respond to this industry's incredible challenge?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things that the restaurant industry is so central to a number of these things that the restaurant industry, we've chosen to be partners in things that are related to farming, related to emergency feeding. But the restaurant community is really focused on a bipartisan piece of legislation supported by about 20 members of the US Senate and about over 100 members of the House, called the Restaurants Act. It was drafted and created by Representative Blumenauer and Senator Wicker. And its primary mode of relief is about $120 billion in direct financial relief to restaurants. And in part, we asked for that and have been pushing really hard for that because of the circular economy that we create and are sitting at the center of in our local communities. And so, we estimate anywhere upwards of 100,000 restaurants could close permanently. When 100,000 restaurants close permanently in our communities, that means jobs, largely jobs staffed by BIPOC, Black, Brown communities and Indigenous communities, largely jobs that are working wages, in some case not even that. So we, without an increase in the national minimum wage. So if we're not open, those communities will suffer even more. And so that has been the primary vehicle that we've been pushing for, to make sure that restaurants are open to employ people, open to provide, to buy from local farmers, open to provide flexible work schedules for working families. And so that's a big thing for us. And I think the other piece about the Restaurants Act that is really important to us as an industry is that so many people, so many small businesses were left out of access to the Paycheck Protection Program. Again, women, and particularly women of color, who were business owners who were not able to access that program because they didn't already have bank accounts or carry debt with established banking institutions, right? So they were shut out of that system from the get-go and unable to access that money. There is money left, but it doesn't mean they're going to be able to access it any easier. And so what we're really fighting for is essentially a grant program that's going to provide direct financial relief to the industry, that then in turn allows the industry, especially small independent restaurants, those with 50 or fewer employees, which traditionally are owned by women and people of color, to then bring back their people, open back up for business, save where they pivot where they need to, provide PPE for their employees, and pay their and support their local food economies. So for us, in addition to the CARES Act and all the other great pieces of legislation that I know chefs are championing, we're really putting our weight behind the Restaurants Act.
Great, great, thank you. Eyang, we all know that there's been an increase in the SNAP enrollments, the need for people to go to, are attending or going to food banks. Can you talk about some of the other policies that have either been expanded, activated, or are new in order to help our food insecure, hunger community, both the existing folks and folks who are increasingly really struggling because of the health and economic challenges right now?
Yeah, sure. I think some of it was touched on a little bit by our panelists. So the first major piece of legislation that we passed that included a significant amount of hunger relief provisions in it was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and we passed that on March 18th. That included some of the things that addressed some of the things that I talked about earlier. We looked at, all right, there's certain population of folks who are eligible for SNAP who are unable to meet certain work requirements. So we waived those work requirements for SNAP in that piece of legislation. We also granted sort of discretion to USDA to work with states to make sure that they can streamline their application and certification process for SNAP applicants. So that means, we need to rethink the interview process. We need to think about, different issuance methods, and we need to think about that some of these state agencies are short-staffed. So those are some of the things that, some of the flexibilities we provided to USDA to be able to extend to states to better serve the growing SNAP population. We provided some emergency SNAP benefits for those households that are not already at the maximum allotment for their household size. Monica spoke about pandemic EBT. The Families First, it was a really unique time to be on the Hill during, especially the early weeks of the pandemics. I think we all sort of didn't really know what to do, and we all sort of came together and put together a piece of legislation that I still look at to this day, that I'm so proud that we were able to get through with relatively very little bipartisan opposition behind the scenes. So pandemic EBT is one of those provisions that we've really seen grow. It basically works that state agencies can apply to USDA to provide EBT benefits to families with children who, if not for the closure of their school for at least 5 consecutive days, would have received free or reduced price meals. And so those EBT benefits help to, kind of mitigate the impact of those school closures. And so that's another area that we're hoping to expand in the next COVID package, or perhaps as a standalone. I think we're going to see that that population of young people are going to need some additional avenues to access food this school year. In our districts, our schools are also doing remote learning in the early weeks of the school year. So pandemic EBT continues to be really impactful. I think most states have adopted pandemic EBT, which is great. We provided additional assistance for food banks, I think $400 million in Families First, and an additional $450 million in the CARES Act. We expanded on that in HEROES, adding an additional $150 million for food banks. I think we all understand that as donations sort of went down, the need for federal assistance to provide commodities to these food banks, continued to increase. So we provided that additional relief. We streamlined the certification process for WIC as well. in the HEROES Act, which I think you, Katherine, may have mentioned that the HEROES Act, it's been a while since since the House passed the HEROES Act. I think May 15th is when we passed that bill. That includes a 15% increase in the maximum SNAP allotment. That is a huge priority for our leadership and Senate leadership to see through. Some additional flexibilities in SNAP to try to get, you know, more benefits to people who need it. Some additional proposals that are out there. Earlier this week, on Monday, my boss, along with all the other Dems on her subcommittee, the Nutrition Oversight and Department Operations Subcommittee and the Agriculture Committee, introduced legislation to expand on those administrative flexibilities in SNAP that were passed in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So we were looking at expanding that to June 2021. So we're hoping that the larger body will take that up. So those are some of the main things that we've been able to do. Also today, very significant, my boss co-led introduction with Chairman Scott of the Education and Labor Committee, a universal free meals bill that would apply to school year 2020-2021. So that obviously is another avenue for young people to be able to access meals, whether they're in the school building or they're learning remotely. So we did a lot, and there's a lot we want to see the Senate pass. So if you guys know anybody in the Senate, please tell them to pass the HEROES Act. We were obviously disappointed that the HEALS Act didn't include any nutrition provisions. So there's a lot more to do. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and you've done a lot, and there is a lot more to do. Thank you so much for that. Monica, you had mentioned on some of the work that Share Strength had done in a couple of cities to partner with the restaurant industry in order to support hungry people, vulnerable communities. There's also some national proposals, some federal proposals that are out there to kind of honor and respect and look at these partnerships that are being created during this pandemic. Could you talk about a couple of those proposals or one in particular that you're focused on at the federal level?
Yeah, sure. I would be delighted to, but I also just want to say that Eyang is being incredibly humble and not really saying how important pandemic EBT was to the entire community, anti-hunger community, and how that was actually implemented in almost all 50 states. So I think she's being incredibly humble about that, because that is the stopgap for kids when they can't access a meal. So I just want to make sure that we all understand the importance of that legislation, that I think it certainly has left a legacy. Going back to, legislation specific to really support the partnerships and the innovations that we're seeing is the Community Meals Fund Act that was introduced by Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, and having conversations over on the Senate side to see if that is legislation that we can get introduced there. I think what we have to recognize is that in the middle of this pandemic, we have all been reacting. There's no question that SNAP is our nation's first line of defense when it comes to preventing hunger. But at the same time, we've had the opportunity to really see a lot of innovation and strategies. And one of them is how the restaurant community can really be a partner in helping us to end hunger, especially under these particular circumstances. And so now is the time for us to really reflect, even though we feel like we don't have time to reflect, and we have, been in nothing but rapid response mode, but to really see what are the opportunities to really incubate these ideas. And I think as we think about, I know for some of us in this area, think about a farm bill, because we know that that's going to be looming, that what did we learn from this, and what are the opportunities going forward? And I think what we can all say is that the restaurant community and sector is a partner when it comes to helping us to feed kids. that we have to recognize that just as the Boys and Girls Clubs and the YMCAs and the food banks and a whole host of other people have come together to really feed their communities, the restaurant community is a part of that. And they've always been a part of that, not just in this particular time. They've always been a part of their communities, even prior to this pandemic. And so I think we have to also see them as a community partner. And what are some of the hurdles and the barriers that currently exist that prevent these partnerships from really being formalized and supported going forward? We have to stop and take a look and say, what are the partnerships that are working? What are those strategies? And how do we want to keep them? And how do we want to incubate them and support them going forward? Our hope is that we're never in another situation like this. Our hope is that we will never be in this kind of circumstance. But I think to the extent that we see how restaurants have really stepped forward, and I've had the pleasure and the honor to be sitting in Hill meetings with a lot of chefs and restaurants, many who might be listening right now, and to hear them tell their compelling story about trying to keep their doors open, having to wonder and be very concerned about their employees, but at the same time stepping up and wanting to be concerned about the people in their community and making sure that they're getting fed, from very rural communities to a lot of urban areas, and to people who had no access to food. We continue to receive those calls every day about communities that don't have access because their entire family has tested positive for COVID. So I think, we have to look at all of the solutions and the things that have worked, and how do we continue to support those partnerships that have been so effective.
Thank you, Monica. Eric, you mentioned quickly in your opening remark about the CPAP program that came out in the first or second package out of USDA. And I want to ask specifically about the Farmer to Family Food Box program, which Secretary Perdue, I think there was a second round that just was allocated for that or opened up again. And Secretary Perdue called it the trifecta of programs, helping producers, suppliers, and people eat. There's been a little controversy. I'd like to hear how it's working for your community and who you're representing. And also, what are the other policies that you are advocating for on behalf of sustainable small farmers?
Thank you. The Farmers to Families Food Box program could have been a trifecta. It had all of the right elements in it, but the policy that scoped it and the implementation of that policy made it less than it could have been. Some of the requirements that USDA decided to implement, including things like GAP certification, which is a food safety certification for farmers, excluded an extraordinary number of small diversified operators that usually sell to restaurants and other institutions. They created some requirements around certification for food hubs that it made it impossible for many restaurants to participate as aggregators of food, maybe packers of these food boxes that could then be distributed to emergency feeding organizations. USDA didn't roll it out in every region. There were states in the first round that had absolutely no awarded contracts, which meant that there were farmers that had produce, restaurants that had workers that needed something to do, and lots of hungry people, but yet they had no program in those states. And then finally, I think USDA really underinvested in the emergency feeding organizations in building their infrastructure and their capacity to accommodate this extraordinary influx of food and boxes. All of that said, it is a good program. It did make a huge difference for a lot of folks, and I don't want to dismiss that. It's just that it could have been a lot better, and it could have really helped out a number of small and mid-sized farmers and restaurants that were excluded from the program. You mentioned that there were 2 rounds of funding, and most recently, just on Monday, USDA issued an additional RFP, a request for proposals, and they made some changes to those proposals, to that request, and it's worrying. Some of the things that USDA decided to include in this sort of second round of RFPs They've dropped the requirements for local and local foods. They've made the boxes a little bit more complicated. For example, now you have to have fruits and vegetables in a box rather than just fruits or vegetables, which right there means that farmers and real small organizations are going to have a hard time meeting the requirements that USDA has for the boxes. So right there, a whole bunch more folks are going to get excluded from the program. And this is beginning to look less like the Farmers to Families Food Box program and more like Secretary Perdue's SNAP replacement program, which is something that the Secretary has triumphed and touted from the beginning of his tenure. His idea that we should replace SNAP benefits and give everybody the opportunity to use those SNAP benefits to purchase food in any supermarket in their community, and replace it with a box of shelf-stable commodities. And that is a very worrying development. We're beginning to see that in the RFP. To the things that we're advocating for, there are many things, and I will say NSAC stands with the folks on this call and many of our allies and partners in recognizing that we absolutely have to increase SNAP benefits. We need an increase in benefits. We need an increase in the minimum allotment of benefits. We absolutely need to get something to support schools to provide school meals for kids, particularly as we're beginning to see the school year delayed. And so we absolutely support those issues and the advocacy there to the fullest extent that we can. Specifically for farmers and farm workers and farm organizations, we need a program that pays farmers that aren't getting paid by the CFAP program. And we need a program that pays folks based on their revenue from the last year that helps make up some of the shortfall without the complicated price modeling that USDA has in the current CFAP program. There are simple proposals out there. We know that folks in the House and the Senate are taking a look at them right now, and we really think that a direct payment program based on revenue is the right way to go, particularly if there are reservations of funds and priorities extended for BIPOC farmers or other historically underserved farmers that have been excluded to a very large degree in the current CFAP program. The other thing that I would mention, just because, you know, I think Katherine, you brought it up, the total commitment of funds from the U.S. government so far to help support farmers, both the CFAP food box program as well as the direct payment program, totals about $23.5 billion in funding, of which about $13.5 billion have been spent so far. So that's about $13.5 billion for first quarter losses for about 2.3 million farmers across the country, just to help everybody kind of understand the scope and scale of the programs that we're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We know that there are a number of other great programs and policies that are being proposed, and not such great ones as well, that you know, we will continue to monitor and share and make sure that you're aware of as we move on. We are at 2:45. This has been a really important conversation. I have one last question that I'm going to open up to the entire panel, and it's a little bit about kind of what we've learned, maybe what we want to focus on moving forward. Given this intense focus on the centuries-old problem of systemic racism, can any of you speak to new systems, new ideas, new policies that you're thinking about that will help break that in the food system as we're looking at it across every area of our country and who we are?
Hey, I don't think it's new, but I am really encouraged by the level of restaurant and restaurant owner, operator interest in stepping into the conversation around an increase in the federal minimum wage and the complete elimination of the sub-minimum wage. You know, we are still an industry where largely labor is paid for by customers. in restaurants, and that then has its own set of inherent biases, potential harassment, power dynamics related to tipping. And if anything, if COVID has done anything for the restaurant industry, it's been a huge wake-up call of the financial and food insecurity of its own workers. About 1 in 3 workers, restaurant workers, before COVID was already on some sort of government assistance related to food, related to SNAP or some other benefit. And this pushed everybody into the brink. And so there's been a real awakening at the owner-operator level of the need to advocate for and support an increase in the national minimum wage. It hasn't moved. I mean, we're at $7.25. Because also restaurants can't do it. Restaurants can't make the changes as individual entities, right? They have to be at a level playing field with other organizations and with other organizations and other employers. And so, that, I think it's not a new innovation at all, but it's a renewed vigor. And then I think the second is, especially within the context of the Restaurants Act, is trying to be a force and a collective voice that says, if we're going to give money, federal government money and direct relief to restaurants, that we should be prioritizing those restaurants that didn't have access to the previous systems, primarily women and people of color owners. So those are the 2 things I'm most, I guess, excited about, is a rejuvenated interest related to how we rebalance some of the financial inequities in the restaurant industry.
Thank you, Catherine.
Hi,
Anyone else?
This is Monica. Yeah, this is Monica. I just, I think, in the nonprofit space, we all work to really meet the needs of people who need it most. But I think what this pandemic has revealed is the inequities. It has really pulled back a curtain for us to really see all of the inequities across all the board. And I think, where today you have 2 in 5 households with children, Black and Latino households who are food insecure, it is really revealing who is really bearing the brunt of this. So we as an organization in our emergency grant funding applied an equity metric and factor to all of our grant giving. We wanted to make sure that we were really serving those communities who were being hardest hit, and that we really took a look at the communities. It wasn't just enough to say that we were giving it to a Latino community. It had to be that, are we giving it to a community that doesn't have enough community assets, who really needs the grants to be able to help expand and meet the need of maybe an immigrant community that is not being served at all? So it really required us to go deeper and not box check by saying we gave to this community, this community. And, over 50% of our grants went to communities of color and organizations that are helping to meet the needs of those communities who have been hardest hit. And then I just want to say something about Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico has gotten absolutely no attention. For almost a month, Puerto Rico did not have any kind of meal distribution on the island, and we've worked with those organizations in Puerto Rico, and today they're getting hit by a storm, and once again they'll be ravaged. And I think it's really important that we continue to keep our eye on all of the communities, including all of the indigenous communities, Native American communities, who have been so hard hit by this pandemic. So for us as an organization, in terms of being, blessed with the generosity of others, but having to move that money out the door to make sure that we were reaching those people most in need, it was a time for us to reflect and make sure that we were going to be very intentional about really doing it through a racial equity lens and an overall equity lens as it related to geography, rural communities, communities with persistent levels of poverty. So I think for us, in some ways, we've really looked at those innovations. I also want to say, importantly, as we think about policy, it's important that that policy, that public policy is equitable, and that it makes sure that everybody has access, and that we don't continue to enact public policy that continues to place unreasonable barriers on people or punitive measures and punishes people for being low income. And, you know, that structural and systemic racism, the anti-Black policies that have been in place that have, you know, really marginalized communities and communities of color have long-lasting effects, and we're seeing them play out today. So I think it's important that we all take that step back and really try to make sure that we're pushing forward on things that will not just be inclusive, but will make sure systemically that everyone has equitable access.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that. We have about 6-7 minutes. If I may, I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that are coming in live from the audience. First question, at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think this is going to be an Eric question, but others should chime in. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw pictures and read articles about crops rotting in the fields. What's the key to a more nimble egg system in the future?
Making it local. The folks that had strong connections within their communities were able to reroute produce and products more quickly than those that were relying on really broad nationwide distribution systems. So we know that local is more resilient inherently. It's also more fair. It's more equitable for farmers. It's more equitable for the folks that are involved in every step of the food system. So we need to invest in our food system in a way that disaggregates some of the centralized control that we have, concentrate on local solutions and local options and local opportunities. So we need more investment in things like local slaughter facilities and local food hubs and smaller scale distribution, and bringing restaurateurs and farmers into closer partnerships. So there are things that we know will work, and that we saw prevent some of those really just, I mean, heartrending photographs of crops rotting in the field, farmers going out of business, all the while when we knew people within their community were struggling with hunger. So there are things that we can do, and hopefully, you know, we'll get the opportunity to begin implementing some of those things in the not too distant future.
Right. Thank you.
Can I go back to your initial question, the question before?
Of course, yes, of course.
Just because I agree with everything that Monica said and everything that Katherine said, just about a livable wage and, you know, increasing the minimum wage. The couple of things that I really wanted to add to those, you know, really great points was that we really need to start looking at policies not in such a siloed way. I think when we were working here in Congress, we work in the Ag Committee and we work in the Education and Labor Committee, and we don't think about how all of these policies across issue areas should really be working together. You know, when we're looking at, you know, eviction moratoriums are you know, have expired, right? They've lapsed. So what does that mean for a program like SNAP that's designed for food for home consumption? So we really need to look at that. We need to look at, you know, perhaps we need to allow for hot food purchases, you know, for that reason, or for those population of people. We need to look at access to transportation. If the pandemic impacts public transportation access for certain communities, what does that mean for accessing grocery stores, for accessing, you know, a means to feed your families? I think we need to really start looking at these things more broadly rather than so siloed. The other thing I want to mention, this is something that I mentioned in a lot of my meetings when I have meetings with companies or corporations or anti-hunger advocates. I've worked in all areas. I've worked at USDA, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, and I think it's really important that we make sure that the people that are working on these policies are as diverse as possible. I think the one thing that my boss always says is that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so it's really important that when we're crafting these policies, for me, it's important that when I'm in the room, I have, you know, I talk about these issues just like we're talking about them freely on this webinar. I talk about, you know, when we're tying things to unemployment, or we're tying things to like USDA last year proposed and then finalized a rule impacting able-bodied adults without dependents. And I think the assumption is, oh, after 3 months, you should be able to find a job. Well, what are the reasons why this certain population of people are unable to find work after 3 months? And so is USDA the right agency to make that decision? You know, and so I think those are all things that we really need to have more conversations about. Those are all things that are going to feed into the next Farm Bill for my boss in particular. So I just wanted to make mention of that before we concluded.
Thank you so much for bringing us back to that question. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I have one more question because we are about 2 minutes before. Let's see. It's not complicated at all. Does the panel think the restaurant bill, and this again might be a Katherine question, and but others can weigh in, that the restaurant bill that the NRA is championing competes with the IRC bill?
Yeah, it's a great question. The National Restaurant Association, the other NRA in our world, right, has a different set of policy priorities that are not entirely aligned with the Independent Restaurant Coalition, in part because they serve in many ways two different constituencies. The Independent Restaurant Coalition is made up of entirely independent, non-chain, non-publicly traded companies and organizations, and so they're really very centered in their local communities in a different way than chains that we all know and love are, right? I was driving to pick up dinner last night from my independent restaurant in New York and passed right by several very well-known publicly traded chains, right? And all those restaurants serve purposes and serve clientele, and they all employ people. So I think together the restaurant industry is making one stand on Congress about how important the overall industry is. The difference in the ask is that independent restaurants want a bill that provides financial relief for those restaurants to help them, you know, as Eric pointed out, as Eyang pointed out, as Monica knows, to help them support those restaurants that are at the heart of our local communities, that are buying from our local farmers, that are employing local workers, and are some of those that are on the front lines of the response here. So I would say that they're two different constituencies represented by two very powerful and energetic advocacy groups and different business owners. But at the end of the day, we're all making the same case before Congress that if restaurants fail, communities will fail. And that's my cat.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you. Everyone, thank you. Thank you, panelists. You are all fabulous humans, and I always learn something when I talk to you. So thank you for your time. There are so many more questions, and Ashley is going to follow up. We're going to answer those questions as soon as we possibly can. Remember, you're going to find a recording of this at the link that was on the first page when we first started this, jamesbeard.org/industry-support-webinars. And we hope to see you all back here next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.